Hello everyone, and welcome to the City and Crumpets podcast. I'm your host, Hikmat Jamal, and today's episode will be dedicated to the King Street Transit Pilot, or, now that it's permanent, the King Street Transit Priority Corridor. Today, I am sitting down remotely, that is, with our guest, David Kuperman. David holds a Bachelor's of Science from the University of Toronto, represent, and a Master's in Transportation Technology and Policy from UC Davis. He is currently the Manager of Transportation Planning with the City of Toronto. Today's episode will begin with the history of the King Street Pilot, followed by the initial reception, some of the results, and finally we'll talk about the future of transit in the city. Hi David, how are you?
Hi Hikmat, I'm doing fine. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, especially with the last few weeks of summer, kind of making sure I get the most out of it before school. So we'll just start right at the top, with the history of the project. So when the pilot was first, the idea for it came, was it inspired by a similar project elsewhere?
That's a good question. So I think that there were a few events that led to eventually a development of the King Street Transit Pilot. And so one of those was TO Core, and that was largely a secondary planning exercise for downtown Toronto, and recognizing that a lot of growth was happening, still is happening, of course, in the downtown core, and that would require improvements to infrastructure, potentially additional open space for people to use, all these new residents moving in. So that was a big part of it. And the King Street Transit Pilot, in one way, was a spin-off of that work. Additionally, I would add that, as everyone knows, there were challenges with reliability of the streetcar service, and a service that was operating fairly close to capacity. And many of the changes that had been implemented, less visibly than the King Street Transit Pilot, but certainly there were operational changes implemented over the first few years prior to the implementation of the pilot. Those had an impact. Those had helped with service, with moving people along King Street, but it was sort of decided that something more was needed. So some of those earlier changes included improvements to transit signal priority. The TTC implemented all-door boarding and proof of payment fare collection. Some stops were removed and consolidated. So all those things had an impact, but I think we decided that we needed to try something new, a bit bigger and bolder.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of choosing King Street as the location, was there any other, what were some of the reasons behind that in terms of, I know it was one of the busier routes, but was that primarily, just for context, how busy was King Street, or how deep were some of the problems that needed to be fixed for something as drastic as a pilot like that?
Mm-hmm. So in one way, it was an easy choice because it wasn't just busy, it was the highest ridership surface route in the city. So, we had at the time about 65,000 riders per day on the 504 King route. And so from that perspective, it had more riders than the Line 4 Shepherd subway, for example. It was obvious that many people were already using the service, and that there was already very high demand, and that if there was one place where we might want to test something out, King Street would be a very good candidate. Additionally, it came with other challenges and opportunities. So I would say challenges because King Street has a fairly narrow right-of-way. There isn't a lot of space to work with, and we knew that we'd have to do something different because we're accommodating large volumes of pedestrians, obviously large volumes of vehicle traffic, and a lot of transit riders. But also opportunity because King Street is not the only east-west major street that runs through the downtown. There are other parallel routes, and so this made for good conditions to do this test, to really understand what the impacts would be of this experiment, and to be able to measure them and to see how and whether it impacted the overall operations of the street network downtown.
Yeah, and you mentioned transit as one of the bigger reasons in terms of improving transit. But were there any other, intended purposes of the project, goals that were held and talked about, whether it's, making it more people oriented or reducing environmental reasons, even like that? Were there any other things were they made explicit in the planning of the project?
hmm So there was a lot of consultation that happened on this project with various stakeholders, and there were public meetings as well. And there was also a project website. So I will probably refer to that a few times. It's an excellent source of information. If you just go to www.toronto.ca/King Street Pilot, everything is there, including the background reports, including the details on the consultation, and also very importantly on the objectives of the project and the monitoring and evaluation program, which was a very big part of it as well. If you look through those materials, you'll see that we had several key objectives, and I would say the top three objectives or themes were um, moving people or improving transit, because
Hmm.
we knew that that would be a big part of moving people better. The next one was improving the public realm. And I think if you've been out on the street the last few years, you'll see various improvements to the public realm. So we were able to do that. We knew that with all the pedestrians, there wasn't necessarily an opportunity to just instantly widen the concrete sidewalk. There
Yeah.
just isn't enough space to do that with all the buildings there, with everything that's going on the street. But we did look for creative ways to provide more space for pedestrians and to improve the public realm. And additionally, of course, we wanted to ensure that that the pilot still worked for the businesses on King Street, because there's a lot of commercial activity on this corridor, and certainly we wanted to continue to support that in whatever we did.
Yeah. And you mentioned some of the earlier changes in terms of increasing in terms of increasing the availability of the transit, the streetcars, or making some of the stops, consolidating some of the stops. But and for people that haven't gone to King Street or checked it out recently, I was actually there just yesterday, so definitely saw some of the changes firsthand. Maybe you can walk us through some of the changes that came into effect with the pilot, whether it's with the, just some of the major changes that would be good. And again, I'd recommend all the listeners to go and see the visuals and see the changes in detail, but maybe just kind of cover that.
hmm Definitely. So I'd mentioned some of the things that we did before the pilot, before this even literally became an idea, and we decided that we would try out a pilot project on the street. So what the King Street Transit pilot did essentially was prioritize streetcar passengers and streetcar traffic, I guess, through the corridor. So um, we knew early on, though we looked at other cities that had tried other transit priority initiatives, and there were um, some in Melbourne, Australia, and Portland, Oregon, and other places like that, so-called transit malls, where uh, either there were sections of street that only allowed transit vehicles and no other vehicles, or they allowed very limited movement by other vehicles. So they restricted traffic either completely or partly in order to give priority to the transit vehicles. And early on, we looked at various options and realized that on King Street, at least in the uh, near term or in the foreseeable future, that would not be an option to just close the street off to general traffic, because there are a lot of deliveries that happen on King Street. There are a lot of buildings that only have their access off King Street, and we knew that we would have to continue to allow that function, moving traffic through the corridor. That said, we settled on a way to allow continued general traffic access, but in a local way. So essentially local traffic only and not through traffic, recognizing that there were alternative routes that through traffic could use, and that likely the streetcars could continue to function and to function well, mixed in with some traffic, but at a lower level, lower volume than there had been. So essentially what the pilot did was it removed left turns and through movements at key intersections throughout the corridor. And the corridor that I keep talking about, of course, is the King Street Transit Pilot Corridor that extends from Bathurst Street in the west to Jarvis Street in the east, because that's a section where we were really seeing a lot of a lot of congestion, a lot of delays with various causes for streetcars, for traffic, for everyone using that section of the street. So that was one major change. Another thing that the transit pilot did was it repurposed that curb lane for other uses, and those included the streetcar stops themselves. So we created temporary platforms in the curb lane. So that was one use. Also, public realm spaces that could be used for public art, for seating, or eventually for some of those wonderful patios that you see, the outdoor cafes in front of some of the businesses. Additionally, there was space for loading zones, both passenger and commercial loading zones, space for right turn lanes, so space for some of those cars and other vehicles to wait in to turn right, since many of them would be turning right off the corridor. So essentially, it meant that at most intersections, the majority of traffic would need to exit King Street, would need to turn right. And then also accessible loading zones. So there were a few places, generally one at each block, where vehicles with accessible parking placards could stop for loading passengers. So for Wheel-Trans, for example, accessible taxis and those types of vehicles. And we also had added some taxi stands also throughout the corridor, in addition to all those other changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, in a project, especially something of this magnitude, there's always going to be some sort of resistance or concerns by community members. And in particular, with the King Street, the changes on King Street, one of the opponents, or not opponents, I guess, but people that were concerned were businesses, right? So, why was that the case? And has that changed until today after the project has been implemented?
Mm-hmm. So I guess I'd say two things about that. So one is that there wasn't a single monolithic response from the business community to this project. There were a variety of opinions, and certainly there were some that were in favor from the start and saw the opportunities for creating maybe a more pedestrian-friendly streetscape, opportunities for beautification, for more of their commercial activity on the street, more pedestrian-oriented. There were others who had concerns about how they would get deliveries, which they rely on from the front of their businesses from King Street, who didn't necessarily have the benefit of rear laneways or other access points. There were some that were concerned about the loss of parking because, as part of the pilot, street parking was removed from this section of King Street. There were parking spaces added elsewhere in the area, but they were removed from King Street. So a variety of opinions. And we essentially, I guess the other major point I would make is that it was a continuous process. It wasn't just before and after, then and now. It was something that we had to work on leading up to the implementation of the pilot. So, spring of 2017, summer of 2017, before the launch of the pilot, that was a very busy time, obviously, for the design and implementation and consultation. But we also had a lot of ongoing conversations about what were the needs of all the different users of the street, including the businesses. That's where we came up with providing the accessible loading zones, providing the other loading zones in general so that businesses could get their deliveries, and passenger loading was allowed as well, especially in front of the theaters. So we had all kinds of conversations about those specific needs and how they could be accommodated within the new King Street. And it was always clear in the report to council, and I think in the minds of staff working on the project. I mean, I led the design and implementation of the pilot, but certainly there was a very large team. I was working with a lot of people to do all of this work. And it was, as I said, it was a continuous process and a lot of discussions, and it was understood that the design would evolve and would respond to needs and changes throughout the pilot. So I think that was clear in the report to council, that we would monitor and we would refine the design and make changes as necessary. So everything that was implemented on day one of the pilot didn't necessarily stay that way for the year and a bit that it went on. There were changes. We had ongoing discussions with the business owners. We launched all kinds of programs. As you saw, public art started showing up on the corridor, and many of those spaces in front of businesses eventually became outdoor cafes. They became the patios, and in some cases, second patios for those businesses. So some of them actually had had the outdoor cafes already, the sidewalk cafes, and some of them even had an opportunity to have a second outdoor cafe within the curb lane space. So I wouldn't say it all happened very suddenly. I would say that there were ongoing tweaks and consultations and discussions that happened, and changes that happened to the design, like adding a loading zone here, taking it away there, converting it to a public realm space, creating that opportunity for an outdoor cafe. All those things happened over time, and I was happy to see that there was a lot of interest. It took a while, but eventually there was a lot of interest in those outdoor cafes and those other uses of the curb lane. And of course, there were other changes that happened throughout the pilot too that were less visible, like changes to signal timing. We were watching to see whether traffic was bunching up at certain intersections and whether there was something we could do there. And so there were all kinds of other changes that happened, but some of the most visible ones were in that curb lane space on the street and on the sidewalk.
Yeah, and you referred to how this process isn't, then and now, and it's continuous work, with changes all the time. And from one of the things I noticed is data was a big part of it. So what were some of the data? What was some of the data that was being collected continuously? And I know just because of how extensive the data was, I'm sure it's very broad. But maybe you can kind of cover what was being collected, what were you looking for, what was the team looking for, and how that was influencing the decisions that were later on being made.
Mm-hmm. So, no, that's a very good point. So, the evaluation monitoring program was a very big component of this pilot. So, we knew that we would need to report back on the performance, on the success of the pilot, and very importantly, there was a report also that went to the October 2017 TTC board meeting, and that outlined. It responded to council direction asking for some of these measures of success, and that outlined what we would be measuring. Of course, it primarily focused on transit measures and transit performance measures. So we wanted to see transit first, that ridership was increasing, or travel times improving, and or reliability of the service was improving. And I think that we saw in the end positive improvements on all of those counts. We also wanted to understand that there were actual measurable improvements to the public realm, that people were enjoying the new streetscape and using those spaces effectively. So there were surveys also that were conducted, and we did a lot of those in partnership with academic institutions and other groups. And we also wanted to see the environmental impact, so noise and air quality. That also is described in the final report to council, and so we also partnered with U of T and Ryerson on those studies. And we also purchased point of sale data to understand what was happening with economic activity in the corridor. And we saw seasonal trends. We saw changes over time in sales and economic activity. It differed by size of business, by sector, and so forth. But I think that in the end, what we found was we found a tremendous increase in daily ridership. It went from 65,000 in 2016 to 72,000 daily riders at the start of the pilot to 84,000 by the end of the pilot. So throughout the course of the pilot, basically we gained 12,000 daily riders on that route. So that was a tremendous change. We also saw improvements to average travel times, particularly westbound in the afternoon, which was one of the more congested periods before. And we also saw pretty significant improvement in reliability. So it's complicated to explain. It's worth looking at the project website to really see the details. But we did see an improvement in vehicle spacing for streetcars, to put it simply. So they weren't bunched and gapped as much as before. And we also saw that the longest travel times also significantly improved. So whereas before, for let's say a roughly 15-minute travel time under ideal conditions from end to end, we were seeing a lot of trips before the pilot in the 25, 30, 35-minute range. A lot of that noise disappeared throughout the pilot. So of course there was still some variability in travel times, but much less. And so there was a much more consistent pattern of travel times between 15 and 20 minutes throughout the corridor. So more reliable travel for streetcar riders, for the streetcars themselves. And as we put all of that together and reported out most figures on a monthly basis, so those were made public on the project website, we saw a lot of those positive signs. Like I said, we did make some changes throughout the pilot. So, certainly we would look at traffic queues coming up here and there at one intersection or another, and we saw if there were operational tweaks we could make to mitigate those. So we did some of that redesign as well. But importantly, we wanted to see the overall picture on all of these different measures. We wanted to see that we were making progress on all the objectives, and I think that we were able to demonstrate that in the end in that final report to council.
Yeah, and one of the worries, actually, especially I remember when the project was kind of still in the pilot phase, one of the worries was increasing the travel times on other east-west routes. And I know the data was collected on some of those routes to see if the King Street pilot was impacting them. And was this the case, or was it minuscule, the changes in other routes?
So thank you for that reminder. Actually, what I forgot to mention was that as part of our data collection efforts, we looked at multimodal volumes. So not just traffic counts of vehicles, but also pedestrian and cyclist counts, and then also travel times for general traffic. And what we found was that there were some fairly minor changes in travel times, and we're looking at the entire downtown network. So not just King Street, but a much larger area, right, including those sort of network of 5 parallel east-west alternative routes. And so we found that there were changes, some of which were seasonal, some of which were related to construction, some of which were related to undoubtedly changing travel patterns and some traffic moving off King Street onto other routes. But we found overall that those changes turned out to be fairly insignificant. When you look at how they compare to sort of the normal variability in traffic that you see day to day, those changes ended up not being terribly significant. So we were able to slightly redistribute traffic without a major impact on the overall network. And another thing that happened is that there was actually a decrease in the number of vehicles overall downtown and an increase in transit ridership. So some people actually, what we saw was some people actually did change modes, and they switched from driving to taking transit or cycling, which I think we'll get into in a few minutes.
Yeah. So you mentioned how one of the changes is, people did change some of the modes of transport as well. So maybe on that note, in terms of the data wasn't, I know, just for cars or streetcars, but also pedestrians and cycling. Can you speak to some of those other modes of transportation, how that was impacted?
Yeah, so what we saw was pretty steady pedestrian volumes. I wouldn't say there was a significant change there, although of course maybe that's changed since the pilot ended. What we found was for cycling, there was actually a very big increase in the number of cyclists using King Street. So even though the redesign didn't include dedicated bike lanes, it did change the conditions for cyclists slightly. So there was space built in to the overall street design for cyclists to use between the moving streetcars and the repurposed curb lane uses. So we did see a pretty significant increase in cycling volumes. I don't quote me on this because I'm just going to refer to the project website and all of the evaluation and monitoring results, but I think at some points we saw like an 8-fold or 8 times increase in cyclist volume. So it was pretty significant. Certainly some of them were coming from other routes, but there were also definitely new cyclists because there was also pretty steady cycling activity on the other corridors, including the Richmond-Adelaide cycle track.
Yeah, that's super interesting and I'm glad you mentioned cycling because as someone who cycles often, not having to drive beside cars without a protected bike lane, for example, like that can be a big deterrent to cycling, right? So I imagine a lot of people did take up cycling, and even did it more often. And I'm glad you mentioned the business aspect of it as well, because I saw that the Ontario Hotel and Motel and Restaurant Association, I believe they're called, they reported a 41% decrease in revenue comparing December 2016 to December 2017, right? So before the pilot and after the pilot. And that when I first saw that, the first thought to my mind is because as someone who's grown up in Toronto, Toronto has very bipolar winters, right? So I did some digging, and in 2016, for example, the year without the pilot, we had 8 days with the temperature in December being below -5 degrees Celsius, and in 2017 that was 16 days, right? So twice as many days with the temperature below -5 degrees Celsius, and even the average temperature for the month is almost double, minus I think -2.5 degrees for 2016, and then -5 degrees or -4.5 degrees for 2017, right? So again, that plays a big role in it as well, definitely. But anyways, the point I'm really trying to get at is businesses are definitely a big part of the conversation when it comes to a project like King Street, with a lot of businesses on the street. And the data of the POS that you guys were collecting in the team, I was wondering if that consultation is ongoing with businesses today, even now, or if you have personally noticed a shift in the approach businesses have had towards a project. Has there been kind of this wholesale shift towards a much more welcoming approach to the project than it was in the beginning?
Yeah, so I guess there are a few things I would say to that. So one is that was definitely a cold winter, and that came with its own challenges. And so that's part of the problem with looking at just a week's worth or a month's worth of data, or just month to month. The weather can change, all kinds of economic conditions can change in that time outside of the pilot. So we were careful to use to look at the figures both for the pilot area and a control area. And certainly there were all kinds of factors, like the cold weather could have kept people at home. The cold weather could have impacted business in other ways. Certainly, there was the activity of the theaters at the time, and that has a direct influence on the restaurants and other businesses in the area. So there were a lot of things going on, so we had to look at a period sort of several years and taking out seasonal variations and so forth. Definitely, we still saw changes, a few small ups and downs, depending on sector and size of business and so forth. But I think that what we found overall was that consultation, that ongoing consultation, was very helpful. We were trying to achieve a good fit between the new King Street and all of the various uses. So the transit passengers, the pedestrians, and the businesses that operate on the corridor. And so I think that we were able to achieve that good fit through those continued discussions. And in some cases we had to provide additional street parking in the area. Not on King Street, but we added some spaces over time to other streets nearby. In some cases, we had to add or increase the size of a loading zone, or change its use from passenger to commercial, and so forth. And then, of course, as I mentioned, there were the public ROM spaces and the outdoor cafes. And over time, there was a pretty significant uptake of those, which also had a very positive impact, I think, on businesses there. So there were these various changes. There was ongoing dialogue, and really, I would say at the end of the day, we were trying to provide that fit and make it an effective and successful street for all the different users. And I think that we were able to achieve that. Of course, some businesses also adapted how they were operating to fit, to take advantage of the new King Street design, and I think that was quite successful in the end. So, as I mentioned, there was a pretty big uptake eventually of the outdoor cafes, and I think that worked very well for some of the businesses. But, of course, every business operates slightly differently, and so we were careful in our consultation to ensure that we were having conversations with those various types of businesses and with the different businesses across the corridor. I'm not directly involved in it anymore in my current role, but I know that there is some degree of ongoing consultation as the pilot corridor becomes a permanent transit priority corridor. So there will be continuing changes in the design and the materials used and so forth, and those involve ongoing discussions with the various stakeholders, including the businesses.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the common themes I even noticed in pretty much any project like this is for it to be successful, which, by all means, the King Street project was successful. It doesn't only require a top-down kind of, policy changes and boom, 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 that's it. Often, like you mentioned, the businesses are adapting and changing how they're conducting business to some extent, whether it's, increasing the emphasis on outdoor dining and that kind of stuff. So that's really interesting, I think, to see, even just for a planning perspective, how that successful policy often works, in that both the tango between, top down and bottom up kind of things as well. Yeah, but moving on with the improved transit times on the 504 being one of the main focuses for the project. Are there lessons in your mind that we can take from King Street towards improving transit elsewhere in the city?
Mm-hmm. I definitely think there are. I wouldn't say necessarily that it's a copy and paste approach. I'm not suggesting that. I guess what I would say is that we learned two things from the King Street Transit pilot. One of them was a pilot approach can be a successful approach. And by that, I mean, there had been various proposals over the years, all sorts of things that we could have done to King Street, and some things that there were some changes, such as the rush hour transit lanes that were not very successful ultimately. There were the various operational changes I talked about, and there were some proposals that never saw the light of day for whatever reason. So the thing that we did differently this time is, certainly this was an effort, a coordinated effort of both the City Planning and Transportation Services divisions at the city and the TTC. And it was a very collaborative approach that involved doing some planning, trying something out that, based on our observations, we thought would assist, would reduce delays and improve performance of the transit system and the people moving capacity of the corridor, and trying it out and refining it and collecting data and then deciding in the end whether it was successful or required further changes. That was a pretty comprehensive and a new approach to take. And so I think that that's something that we could do elsewhere, certainly in places where the exact solution may not be obvious right now, but we have an idea of how we might make improvements, and it's worth trying out on a temporary basis and monitoring and then deciding whether to keep or not. That's definitely something that we could do. And I guess the other lesson is that every street and every context is different. And I guess one of the things that this showed was that there are options, and they might not be immediately apparent. It doesn't necessarily mean doing things the way we've always done them before, or even the way that other places are doing them. This particular solution was a made in Toronto solution. So I think it just means that we really need to identify what are our objectives for the street, the corridor, the area. What are we trying to do? How do we make it more effective, and what are those measures of success? And then considering various options, things we've never done before, and then measuring and observing and seeing how well those work.
Yeah, for sure. And even on that topic, I guess, of kind of being flexible and looking at each street holistically, based on what would work there in each part of the city. One of the things, I guess, maybe that could be a bit more general, and I want to get your opinion on this, is, because often there is this public kind of, the effect the word subway has on people. A subway is seen as, the one bullet stop, that will fix everything in a particular part of the city, for example. In your mind, is King Street an example where, without digging, multi-billion-dollar tunnels, you can improve transit significantly, even by just using existing infrastructure? Like, you already have the road, you have the streetcars already, it's a couple of changes, and you've increased ridership 12,000, for example. Is that something that is a lesson from King Street as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very important point as well, and something that was definitely considered in conceiving the pilot project. So at the time that consultation was happening on this pilot, the relief line study was underway. And even then, we knew that even if a new subway through the downtown were to get approved, that would take probably 10 years, right, to go
Yeah.
through approvals, design, construction, etc. And we knew that there were problems at the time. There were issues with the reliability of transit, with how well King Street was functioning for everyone, that probably couldn't wait those 10 years or more.
Hmm.
And so yes, this was an attempt to do what we could with the space we had, with the resources we had, to improve conditions as much as possible, even ahead of any major infrastructure project. Of course, it's not a replacement. The King Street corridor as it operates today is not a subway. It's not the same thing. Um, that said, even with a subway, there are different users that are served by the King Street
Yeah.
streetcar, and there are local trips that wouldn't be well served by a future subway. And the Relief line is now the Ontario line, and that has a slightly different operating characteristics and a different alignment. So I think that they're connected. We definitely saw a need for more capacity and improvements in the downtown ahead of major infrastructure projects like a new subway, but it is also sort of a separate issue as well. There are different trips that need to be accommodated on the streetcar or on King Street locally, and changes to the streetscape that are also somewhat independent of those longer term, bigger infrastructure projects. That said, for sure, there's a place for both and a need for both types of approaches and both types of projects. Certainly, a new subway line can have a capacity of 30,000 passengers per hour, and that's
Hmm.
not something that you can replicate on the streetcar. But that said, we did increase the hourly capacity of the King streetcar from roughly 2,000 to 3,000 passengers per hour per direction. So there was a pretty significant gain there.
Yeah. And then even you also mentioned how different types of design serves different type of people. A streetcar will serve, for example, more local populations, and even just there's just a whole different demographic going in versus the subway line. Um, and then just recently in Toronto, I think near Kensington. I just walked by a poster on a light post, which said streets for people, take back our streets kind of thing. So maybe just are there in I know the data is pretty broad. It does try to quantify things like people using the patios and pedestrian usage and that kind of stuff. But there are, I'm sure, some intangibles that obviously that data can't always capture. But in your mind, is this street, the King Street project, is this what are your thoughts on streets for people and kind of reclaiming this idea of reclaiming streets from the automobile that some people always talk about?
Hmm. So I think it's a very appealing idea, but I guess I don't want to generalize too much. I mean, I guess what I'd like to say is that context matters. That really you need to have a discussion with everyone involved, with residents, with businesses, with all kinds of stakeholders about really what needs a street or a public space are fulfilling, and then decide on what the best way is to address any gaps there. So I don't think it would be the same approach everywhere. Streets in particular, I guess in the urban planning world and in the transportation field in general, we talk about as serving um, many different needs, but those might fall into two groups. So one might be mobility or movement,
Hmm.
and the other is, we like to call it placemaking. There are various other terms related to that. But typically it's recognized that streets serve both functions to a different extent. And it's also recognized that one may be more important on some streets than the other. And so there are places definitely that we primarily want to be open spaces, where we talk about placemaking and things like public art and things like pedestrian priority and spaces for people to linger, and all kinds of things like that we talk about in the public realm. And then we also talk about just movement and mobility and getting from A to B. And it's not that only one is important or that one is better than the other. Definitely we have a need for both of those. So we have to work to find a balance between those. Sometimes they work wonderfully together. Sometimes occasionally they come into conflict with each other, but we have to have a discussion about sort of what are our needs and values, what are we trying to achieve. I think that a good balance was struck on King Street in the sense that we actually did see gains in mobility in that movement on the street. And we found at the end that despite slightly fewer vehicles in the downtown and higher ridership on the streetcar and more cyclists, the net effect was actually that we were moving more people each day through the downtown. So that's an interesting thing to think about because we implemented some traffic restrictions, right?
Yeah.
And despite implementing traffic restrictions selectively at some intersections, the overall result was that more people were actually moving through Toronto's downtown. So that was an interesting observation and achievement. And at the same time, there were improvements to the public realm. There was more space for pedestrians because with the streetcar stops bumped out into the curb lane, that provided more space on the sidewalk for people to walk through. There were additional seating areas and all kinds of public spaces that opened up as well. So certainly, I think we saw improvements on both fronts there, but I guess I would just want to emphasize that point that every street and every context is different. We really have to have that conversation about what are our values and needs and how best to serve them in each of those contexts.
Yeah, definitely. And I was just going to mention that as well with, King Street just seems like that perfect balance because you did improve mobility and then also the street itself, the placemaking on the street. Just from like, it takes literally 5 minutes to go and see the differences. If you've been there in like 2016, 2015, you'll notice the differences. And I would definitely encourage everyone to go, if you're in downtown, give it a shot, check it out. And I can see how it would be tempting to kind of want wholesale applications in other streets. I've heard people say Queen Street and here and there, where, they just want a copy and paste kind of thing, which has their own challenges, I guess. And then maybe just to end off, with the project now being permanent, what else, I guess, in the context of King Street? I know it isn't still perfect in any, there's always efforts to improve things. And I know you mentioned you're not involved with King Street in particular anymore. But what else do you think when you were involved, I guess, what else can be done to transform King Street or I guess to keep improving some of the things that were the goals?
Mm-hmm. So I guess I mentioned that as this moves to becoming a permanent design of King Street, there will be various changes and ongoing discussion with the various users of the street. So what that means is that we put up an awful lot of signs, traffic signs during the pilot, right? And for better or worse, that's what was needed at the time to make clear the new way of getting around King Street. Certainly, the permanent design we'll be taking another look at that, whether there are opportunities to sort of maybe clean up the signs or make changes to the signals or something else that's just makes clear to users of the street how it's meant to work.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that can happen. Materials as well will change over time to become more permanent. Remember that all the materials used for the King Street pilot were temporary and low cost materials. So they were something that we could put in and take out easily and quickly as necessary. So there will be a sort of over time a change to more permanent materials and sort of higher quality materials and design with available resources. So that will happen. Additionally, I don't know. Predicting the future is very hard. Predicting the situation we're in right now with the COVID-19 pandemic would have been impossible. It would have been very difficult, right, to understand where we would be today. So all kinds of things can happen and conditions can change and the economy can change. So I don't know what that means for King Street. I don't want to make any specific predictions on that. I would just say that we'll continue to think about how to make it a more permanent and maybe higher quality design with available resources, and we'll just have to continue to respond to the conditions there because of course there's still a lot of growth and development and there are new residents and new businesses, and as those needs emerge, as those conditions change, they'll require just some degree of ongoing consultation.
I think we'll end it off on that note. Thank you so much, David, for joining us. This was a really fun episode, and I would recommend everyone to go to www.toronto.ca/kingstreetpilot to find the overview, graphs, charts, and a whole lot of information we just couldn't cover in this brief podcast. Heck, if you find yourself downtown, go for a walk down King Street and see some of the changes for yourself. Check out some of the patios, the businesses, and enjoy the public space that's there. That's all from me this time. Remember to check us out on Twitter at City and Crumpets, and also check out our podcast website, www.citycrumpets.pinecast.co. Remember to subscribe, share, and most importantly, go out and see the city. Till next time, bye.